When you look back at all the great developers from the 90s and early 2000s, Raven Software is definitely going to be up there with the best of them. Despite having a pretty damn impressive resume of consistent releases from 1992 and onwards, they're arguably most well known for their first-person shooters, along with their eventual transition into full-time assists for the Call of Duty series. What some people might not know or remember though is that they're absolutely responsible for some of the best FPS games ever made. So I thought it might be worth going back and taking a look through all of them. Now, despite working on a first-person RPG in the early 90s with Black Crypt, and a game running on a modified version of the Wolfenstein 3D engine with Shadowcaster, it wasn't until 1993 CyClones that Raven Software made their first proper first-person shooter. A title which I think perfectly captures the look, tone, and aesthetic of what 90s PC gaming was all about. I mean, the early 90s was around that time period where CD-ROMs were starting to become commonplace, and this meant we started to see a lot of PC games utilising full motion video, which in CyClones' case equates to low-resolution clips that are about the size of a matchbox with pixels so large you can barely even see what you're looking at.
Primary objective of this operation is unknown at this time.
And yeah, nothing says cutting-edge gaming like grainy, low frame rate footage of underpaid actors hamming it up on a cheap-looking set, along with some unintentionally funny voice acting and really bad microphone quality. In fact, a lot of the time it sounds like the actors haven't even been mic'd up properly, and they've just used the audio from the camera.
Once AI Central receives the auto-destruct signal from the facility, a second security tone will be transmitted.
Anyway, the story in CyClones is set at some point in the future when Earth is under attack by aliens and humanity is apparently completely getting wiped out. You're playing as a guy named Havoc, a cybernetic super soldier created by combining human and alien DNA.
Wait, that's illegal.
With the sole objective to push back all of these invaders. During that opening cinematic, we get a nice shot of Havoc's bare ass, along with this cheesy montage with backing music that kind of sounds like the theme to the Mortal Kombat movie. Which is especially crazy because that movie didn't come out for another 2 years.
You fool!
As for the gameplay, it's comprised of a bunch of missions where you're off on your lonesome, completing objectives and killing everything else that moves. And even for the time, CyClones had a pretty unique control scheme, having a lot in common with a game like System Shock, where instead of your weapon being locked ahead all the time, you can instead aim anywhere within the screen to attack, but also interact with objects by clicking on them. You start off with a pistol, but then quickly find a chain gun, which you'll spend the vast majority of the game using. Later on, there's also an alien pistol and eventually an alien rifle, both of which do decent damage but fire projectiles that move needlessly slowly. And half the time as well, like the bullets don't even seem to hit what you're aiming at, ending in the player taking extra damage. But that's not the problem. The problem is CyClones' level design. And this comes from that period in the 90s where first-person shooters always seemed to have maze-like level design. Doom had come out a year prior and thankfully started to move away from that trend. But this kind of thing still sadly permeated in a lot of titles, CyClones included. Which means that levels often just feel like a random series of tunnels, rooms, and corridors without any real purpose or structure, because that's what they are. What's not helping either is that finding what's more or less secret walls and doors is essential to progression. I mean, even as early as the second level, you need to keep your eye out for hidden doors and hollow walls, which are walls that appear solid but can actually be walked through. And then this is something that the level design relies on frequently, requiring you to constantly check your map screen to identify where these walls are, because otherwise there's not going to be any kind of clue. Just kind of encapsulates that early era for FPS games, where level design just used to be complex and confusing, if for no other reason than just to extend the longevity the player got out of the whole experience.
This mission will separate the men from the... whatever.
And so many times here, like, I found myself walking around a level for 20 or 30 minutes, long after I'd killed everything, simply because I'd missed that one switch or door that I was supposed to interact with. One mission even has you running around trying to find 9 separate data disks, which then need to be inserted into 9 different security terminals, all of which are completely hidden away.
This is a code red RDM.
Now look, in fairness, CyClones ain't exactly the worstest thing ever made, and there is a bit of charm there in its antiquated mechanics and visuals, but the long and short of it is that, like so many other titles from 1993 and onwards, got completely overshadowed by Doom. And in fact, during the development of CyClones, half of the Raven Software team were already hard at work putting id Software's glorious new Doom engine to work with Heretic. Yeah, son, like it's only 1994, but we're already starting to get into the good shit, with the first of many Raven Software games that used an id Tech engine, and one that's also a polar opposite to Doom in terms of the theme and premise, taking place in a dark fantasy setting as opposed to hellish science fiction. And I still remember playing through the shareware episode for this thing relentlessly over and over, finding every secret area and hidden item that I possibly could. Plus, it's also the first game that I ever had a strategy guide for. Right, so the story is you're playing as an elf named Corvus, in a world where 3 powerful creatures named Serpent Riders have decimated the place and left it in ruins, with Corvus being the last one left alive and the only one who's able to reclaim the realms. The big bad guy you're going after is the first Serpent Rider named Disparral, and Corvus needs to make his way through the remnants of his homeland, then venturing into what's more or less hell until finally reaching Disparral's underwater lair. Sadly, not a hollowed out volcano. And in a lot of ways, like Heretic is really just medieval Doom. I mean, for starters, both games run in the exact same engine. It was also originally split into 3 episodes with about 9 levels each, and the 8th level always culminating in a boss fight. And if you want to get even more specific, the first episode was also released as shareware, and ends in a fight against 2 of the tougher monsters, who would also then come back in the ensuing episodes as standard enemies. But even the weapons are pretty much just following along with Doom's template. The starting wand is more or less the pistol, and then the wooden staff is the same as the fists. The crossbow replaces the shotgun, the dragon's claw replaces the chain gun, the phoenix rod is more or less your rocket launcher, and then the hell staff is pretty much the same as the plasma rifle.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
There's even a melee weapon too with infinite ammo called the Gauntlets of the Necromancer, which fires out electricity at close range, similar to Doom's chainsaw. About the only new weapon they've got here is the Fire Mace, which shoots out these metallic balls that bounce all over the place, also having a sound effect that kind of sounds like a helicopter in an old 8-bit game. So it's an arsenal that reuses all the same ideas, and you'll be using these weapons more or less the same as you would in Doom. You'll even hear Corvus laugh to himself every time he picks a new weapon up. You know, like how you'd catch Doom Guy smiling when he came across a new gun as well. Heretic's combat is also very similar, involving a lot of circle strafing to avoid incoming projectiles, along with fighting back against a whole range of different enemy types, either melee or ranged, all of whom can again be tricked into infighting or baited near what may as well be exploding barrels. A lot of the items are also identical as well. You got a torch which lights everything up, there's a scroll which reveals the entire auto map, a bag which doubles your ammo capacity, and even an invincibility and invisibility item, along with some new and creative inclusions like the Morph Ovum, which fires out a bunch of eggs that turns enemies into chickens. Plus, without a doubt, what is one of the most useful ones with the Tome of Power, which buffs up the damage all of your weapons do for a short period of time, with every single weapon having a different effect, which is kind of awesome. I think my favourite one to use it with is the Dragon's Claw, which fires out these humongous spiked balls in all directions. And yeah, not the kind of balls your mum gargles on either. The main point of difference is that Heretic had an actual inventory system, meaning you didn't have to immediately use these items as soon as you picked them all up, and could activate them when you wanted to and when it benefited the player the most. Like the quartz flasks, for instance, were a handy way of getting your health back in a pinch if you couldn't find any nearby crystal vials. And getting out one of those tomes of power at just the right time could also turn a fight in your favour if you were getting overwhelmed. They do say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery though, and that is absolutely the case here considering that Heretic has managed to copy across the most important aspect, meaning that just like Doom, it's also an awesome shooter. And even playing through it now in 2024, I'm still surprised at just how much fun the whole thing is. And if you're playing it with that expansion pack, which comes with another 2 full episodes, well, there's even more value to be had as well. I don't know, man, like there's just something about circles strafing around and shooting things in the Doom engine which really never does get old.
You're goddamn right.
And Heretic's dark and gritty setting, replacing demons and zombified marines with undead warriors and gargoyles, still really sets this one apart. It's influenced a whole lot of shooters as well, just like Doom has, with recent titles like A Medieval, Graven, and Wizardom. And look, while its fan base might not be as big, it's absolutely still one of the best of the old school heavyweights. And then barely a year later in 1995, they followed it up with the sequel, Hexen Beyond Heretic.
Greetings, mortal. Are you ready to die?
Yeah, they're not kidding either, because compared to Heretic, which really just felt like it was a bit of a Doom clone, Hexen is an entirely different beast altogether. Being one of the most challenging shooters to come out of that time period. Following on after the defeat of Disparal, Hexen's antagonist is the second Serpent Rider named Korax. And this time, instead of just playing as one character, you're able to choose from 3, with Baratus the Fighter, Parias the Cleric, and then Daedalon the Mage. Basically, Baratus and Daedalon are like the warrior and magic classes, whereas Parias is supposed to be like a mixture of the two, perfectly balanced as all things should be. There's also a lot of returning items here as well from Heretic, like the quartz flasks and tomes of power, along with the flechettes, which are explosive items that act differently depending on which class you're playing as. However, the main difference between each of these 3 characters is their basic stats, like movement, speed, and armor, but more importantly, their weapons, with each of them having 4 unique weapons entirely, and ammo simplified into either blue or green mana pickups. So Baratus starts with his gauntlets, along with melee weapons like an axe and a hammer. Whereas Daedalon starts with a wand, and then has access to powerful ice and lightning spells. Parias, on the other hand, again is a mixture of both. His starting weapon is a mace, which is about as effective as a child's toy, along with a magic staff and then a fire projectile. But a lot of these weapons are really well designed and fun to use. I mean, the Hammer of Retribution, for instance, works as a melee weapon at close range, but then from a distance it launches out projectiles which explode on impact. Daedalon's frost shards can turn enemies into blocks of ice, and his Arc of Lightning spell can even penetrate shields and damage enemies over time. And then Parias' Serpent Staff is effective at long range, but can also leech life away from enemies if used at point blank range. So it's a lot more than just shooting things over and over with little to no variation. Then throughout each area, you're also finding components for a 4th and more powerful final weapon, which is again unique to each character. However, it is Parias' Wraith Verge that is objectively the absolute best of the bunch. Now this is a powerful staff that fires out a bunch of super pissed off ghosts that then fly around the immediate area and tear nearby enemies to pieces. And the sound effect this thing makes alone is completely terrifying. It just seems like Raven have done all they could here to really remove a lot of the Doom comparisons that people made with Heretic, you know, and really set this new roster of weapons apart, which is something I think they've absolutely accomplished. the main difference that Hexen has to Heretic is the level design, and gone is the traditional key hunting fare replaced with exploring much more detailed and intricate environments, collecting crucial items and flipping lots of random switches, along with backtracking and then trying to figure out just what the hell everything actually does.
Oh, fuck.
Instead of 3 episodes broken down into 8 stages, there's now 5 different chapters, with each chapter instead having a central hub of sorts, and then different portals teleporting you to completely separate side areas, all of which harbour those important items and objectives. And even the first couple of chapters can be super confusing and very easy to get lost in. I mean, the second hub, as an example, has 3 different realms you need to explore, with there then being 6 different switches hidden away you'll need to find. The hub after that has another 3 realms, 6 more switches, but then also 3 hidden keys. And yeah, like playing through Hexen as a kid, like I'm not ashamed to say that this thing absolutely stumped me. In fact, it wasn't until I was in my late teens that I was finally able to properly beat it. Now, this kind of thing is both to Hexen's benefit and detriment. I mean, it's a benefit in the way that it truly does separate it from just being a bit of a Doom clone and makes it feel like its own thing. But then it is a detriment in the way that it also turned off a lot of people from even giving it a proper chance and playing through it to begin with. Yeah, and let's just say too that the parroted opinions of certain YouTubers aren't really helping the game's reputation either. The puzzles can often seem confusing at times as well, but what people often seem to forget is that sense of accomplishment you get. You know, when you actually figure out what the game's trying to get you to do. And besides, like, no one ever said that saving the world from a portal-hopping serpent rider was going to be easy, did they? Either way though, until Hexen II came out a few years later, this was without a doubt one of, if not the most hardcore first-person shooters you could play on the PC.
Then again, maybe not.
And yeah, next up, we're continuing with this whole Hexen Heretic multiverse with Hexen II, released in 1997. And if you've been keeping up with this story so far, well, you'll remember that 2 of the 3 original Serpent Riders are now worm food, leaving only 1 left. However, unlucky for us, this is supposedly the most powerful one of all, named Eidolon. And aside from dealing with this humongous arsehole, the players also got to contend with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, yeah, who were doing the guy's bidding. And look, like, despite how anyone feels about Hexen 2, no one can deny that that premise alone is just beyond badass. Now, if Hexen was Heretic on steroids, well, then Hexen 2 is Hexen on meth. And this is without a doubt the most hardcore game in the series. Also again though, being something of a universal upgrade across the board. I mean, for starters, like, the engines made the jump from 2.5D to fully 3D, with the evolution from the id Tech 1 engine to the id Tech 2, or the Quake engine. And instead of being able to choose from 3 characters to play as, you can now choose from 4, with the Assassin, the Paladin, Crusader, and the Necromancer. Which again affects the player's stats, along with which kind of weapons you're going to get. There seems to be more of a focus on the RPG side of things as well, with each character able to level up the more you play the game, which unlocks new passive abilities. Like the Necromancer, for instance, can get the ability to pick up souls from fallen enemies, and the Assassin can hide in the shadows if she stands still. Just like the first game as well, you're also looking out for the components for each character's 4th weapon, though this time you only need 2 pieces instead of 3. And again, once you get these are without a doubt the best weapons in your arsenal. I also reckon there's a lot more variety between each of these hub eras as well, ranging from a medieval castle and village, you got a series of Aztec pyramids, Egyptian catacombs, and eventually Greco-Roman temples. This is without a doubt as well the most confusing game that Raven Software have ever made, and I genuinely don't think that there's anyone out there who's managed to beat this without using a walkthrough. Compared to Hexen 1, which was usually just about finding and flipping the right amount of switches, Hexen 2's puzzles are more often than not about finding a whole bunch of items and then combining them with other items to create something new entirely. Like the first hub alone, for instance, you'll need to find the bones of a long-dead king, then take the bones to a nearby mill, assuming you've first found the mill key, and then grind them down before then taking them to a wizard's lab to convert it to a magical potion. A potion which then allows you to access a hidden room. Yeah, a room which happens to be underwater underneath an old castle. And even then, like, to get to that castle, there's like 3 or 4 other things you're going to need to do beforehand. And then try to remember that that's the first hub of 4 you've got to get through.
Oh, that's it. I've had it with this dump.
One puzzle later on has you time traveling to 2 separate time periods and messing around with the sundial to set it to some kind of specific constellation. And for this one, like, I genuinely have no idea how you're supposed to figure this out organically. It's just one of those games where every time I go back to replay it, I inevitably end up having to look a guide up just to see where I'm going wrong. And I think its crushing design is a bit of a reason as to why you don't hear people talking about it that much. Probably also didn't help either is that 1997 was the same year that Duke Nukem 3D, Blood and Shadow Warrior, and more importantly Quake were unleashed on the gaming world. So the premise of being stuck in a dimly lit Aztec pyramid, fighting raging werepanthers as you walked in circles for hours, you know, probably didn't seem like the best way to spend your time.
Shit.
Does that make it bad though? Well, no, not at all. And much like the first game, there is a lot of satisfaction when you finally figure out that confusing puzzle. You know, assuming you found it out on your own. Out of all the games on this list though, this one right here is without a doubt the toughest. So remember, anyone who tells you they beat it without cheating or looking at the answers is a filthy liar. Looking back at gaming in the early 2000s, it just really reminds me of that point in time where the media and uneducated boomers started focusing their efforts on complaining about video games.
Terrific, terrific.
And more importantly, the damage they apparently caused on the younger generation like me who were hooked on playing them. Still remember how Duke Nukem 3D got censored when it first launched in Australia, cutting out all the violence and pixelated boobs? And then only a few years later, there we were again with something even better, with Soldier of Fortune, a game which amazingly somehow got away with it. The story in Soldier of Fortune is that you're playing as a mercenary named John Mullins, working for the Fictional Shop, a clandestine organisation that deals with terrorist threats around the globe.
I'm ready. Then get online. Let's see what the shop has for you.
With the overall plot being about a bunch of stolen nukes that John has to reclaim, travelling to Serbia, Russia, Iraq, Japan, Sudan, and eventually Germany. It's suitably cheesy stuff, not really meant to be taken all that seriously, with missions often ending with John running away from explosions and in typical tough guy fashion, not looking back. But what I always remember the most about Soldier of Fortune is that it was the first proper violent video game that I ever played. I mean, sure, like we had violent games beforehand, and titles like Duke Nukem 3D and Blood are good examples of that, but all of the stuff in that was mostly just aliens and monsters. Soldier of Fortune was the first time it seemed to be somewhat realistic and grounded in the real world, which you can see to great effect in even the opening level, moving through the New York City subway and dissecting skinheads with a shotgun. The main enemy faction you were going up against was also a group of white supremacists. And I just can't think of any other game I'd played before this that had done something like that. It also featured the groundbreaking ghoul damage system, where enemies would dynamically react to being shot in different body parts. Like shoot someone in the leg for instance and they'd hop around, shoot their hand and they'd shake it in pain, or blow their head clean off and they'd simply slump to the ground like a pathetic headless loser. Yeah, nice one, dumbass. So in a way, like, it really is one of those games that marked the end of the more comical and 2D sprite shooters of the 90s, and signified the evolution of the genre into fully 3D.
Saddam himself.
Yeah, man, this is getting me so hot.
Along with these more realistic, real-world shooters we'd start to get in the early 2000s and moving onward. After Heretic 2 as well, this is the second time that Raven Software have used the Quake 2 engine, and there's definitely an understated charm here to the simplistic design and modelling with all the environments and characters. But it does make up for that as well in the fact that there is a whole lot of variety between all of these missions, with there being a clear distinction in not only the backdrop but the enemy types as well. And I want to say as well that there's just something about video games from the early 2000s when they had levels set in Asian countries that I always just seem to find appealing. A lot of the weapons as well are fictionalized versions of their real-world counterparts. Like the Silver Talon handgun, for instance, is pretty much just a Desert Eagle, and the combat shotgun is a Spaz 12. And what can I say about this Spaz 12 that I haven't already said a dozen times over?
Perfection.
Plus you got an RPG which looks the same as the one that Arnie uses in the movie Commando, and I'd love to think that that reference was intentional. There's also a few made up weapons like the slug thrower and the microwave gun, all of which have absolutely zero recoil and can be fired indefinitely with perfect precision. So it really just epitomizes the apex of the whole run and gun shooter subgenre, and almost every mission is little more than just holding down the W button and shooting at everything that moves. Often with the machine gun or the shotgun, both of which are just an absolute force of nature. I think my favourite thing here is those soldiers in the Kosovo mission, who all have gas tanks on their backs which can be shot at and explode, which sets them on fire. And honestly, like, there's just so little worth complaining about where the gameplay is concerned. It's just one of those games where I end up coming back to it every year or so and blasting through it in a matter of hours.
I'm most impressed you made it this far, Mr. Mullins.
Because the missions are varied, the weapons are loud and fun to use, and there's nothing in the campaign that ever feels like a chore or a slog to sit through. It's just a timeless story, man, about a patriotic gun for hire, mowing down white supremacists with a shotgun that has the magical ability to make body parts disappear.
Kill him!
So out of all the games in this list, this is the one right here that I would unequivocally recommend. Damn good stuff. After that, Raven Software followed it up with Star Trek Voyager Elite Force in 2000. Yeah, Star Trek game. Letting you play as Alex Monroe, either a male or female member of the newly formed Hazard team, which pretty much just a fancy word for a red shirt.
Acknowledged.
Taking place around the 6th season of Voyage's timeline, Elite Force was kinda cool in the way that it not only featured some of those key characters, but also got the same actors and actresses to reprise their roles.
Your injuries seem to be rather superficial. Dermal regeneration will not be necessary.
Which gives it a real sense of authenticity, along with the attention to detail and clear love for the source material.
Photon torpedoes, full spray.
The story is that you're on the USS Voyager, which has been transported to some kind of starship graveyard after coming under attack by a mysterious vessel.
Until repairs are done, we're utterly helpless. Stranded.
And then while they're all trying to make repairs, Monroe and the Hazard team visit nearby ships, salvaging parts to repair Voyager, along with uncovering the reason as to why they're there. With Alex even doing a bit of repairing here and there too. You know, really putting the Hazard into Hazard Force.
Thanks, that was close.
Honestly though, like, a lot of it just feels like it exists to be pure fan service, aimed at people who are obviously into the TV show. But even for someone like me, who honestly couldn't give less of a shit about Star Trek if you paid me to, there is still a lot of novelty and charm here in exploring some of these environments. For instance, the game opens up with a prologue mission in a Borg cube, which is just rife with id Tech 3 engine charm. You'll also have to sneak around a Klingon ship trying to stay undetected, along with just being able to explore different sections back on Voyager. In fact, there's even like a whole side mode separate from the campaign, where you can explore the entire ship at your leisure and even bugger around in the holodeck. It's just one of those games that's an early example where the art style and the talent of the people who created it can supersede the technical limitations. And although this might be one of the earliest games to use that Quake 3 engine, it still looks pretty damn good at times. It's kind of funny to think as well that this game came out right after Soldier of Fortune, and given how violent that game was, I mean, the combat in Elite Force is like shooting people with Nerf darts in comparison. Outside of all the nerdy fan service stuff though, there ain't really that much depth to Elite Force's gameplay, and otherwise it's just a pretty standard shooter, with a limited and even somewhat unexciting roster of weapons. There's a couple of times there where you're encouraged to avoid detection, but it's a mechanic that's not very well developed, and then once you're seen, everyone knows where you are anyway, so shooting your way through things is often faster and just easier.
Monroe, what's going on down there? You're supposed to avoid detection.
Weapons are either energy-based, which is mostly the weapons you're given by the Voyager crew, and these can be recharged through finding energy terminals. Then you've got all the scavenged weapons you find throughout the various missions, which require these special crystals. But even then, like most of these are just some form of energy weapon that fires a laser anyway. And regardless of the overall mission goal, it quickly falls into that rhythm of just shooting the same looking one or two enemy variants over and over, be it the Borg, the Klingons, or what I can only describe as space gorilla moss. About the most creative thing the game does here is during that opening Borg mission, these guys can quickly become resistant to your weapons. But then about 2 minutes later you get a gun that just bypasses their defenses completely, and then that concept just never comes back. Despite being able to play as either a male or a female, that doesn't seem to really change the overarching story either. And though there are decisions you can make throughout the game, these don't seem to affect things in any meaningful way. And it's not that any of this stuff is bad, but I do feel like a lot of the charm here is going to be reliant on how big a fan you are of the TV series. By far though, the most fun aspect to Elite Force is the holo match mode, which really is just like a total conversion for Quake 3. Now this is the online component of the game and includes a whole bunch of deathmatch maps, along with various characters to play as from the base game, and this whole mode is just effortlessly addictive. In fact, even just playing through it solo and going up against all the bots in the preset matches can be a really good way to kill a couple of hours. Excellent. I mean, you'll definitely be playing through this mode long after you finish the story, let's just put it that way.
You win. Your commendation? Sharpshooter.
So all up, like, this is easily one of the best Star Trek games ever made. You know, even if that isn't the biggest receptacle to be scooping from. There was a sequel that came out a few years later, created by Ritual Entertainment, but I think that game became a victim of trying to do too many new things. So at the end of the day, Elite Force let me shoot Klingons, stare at 7 of 9's ass, and get beamed down. So really, it did everything that it ever needed to do.
Hey pal, did you get a load of the nerd?
Now throughout the years there's always been a trend with Raven Software either working on a series that someone else had worked on before them or vice versa, and 2002's Jedi Outcast is a perfect example of that. With both Dark Forces and Jedi Knight being created by LucasArts, but then Raven Software coming in to take over for this third entry, which is arguably too the best in the entire series, and also just one of the best Star Wars games ever made, period. Jedi Outcast follows on from the events in the previous game, playing as returning champion Kyle Katarn.
Alright, I'm clear.
After the events in Jedi Knight, which saw Kyle almost fall to the dark side, he severed his connection to the Force and resumed working for the New Republic as a sort of gun for hire. In the opening levels of the game, Kyle and his Gao Pal Gen also were investigating a supposedly abandoned base, only to instead find it crawling with Imperial forces. Kyle then soon butts heads with a guy who can be best described as a humanoid dinosaur named Dasan.
Well, you look like an overgrown Quakian monkey lizard.
And along with his apprentice Tavion, they seemingly murder Jan so that Kyle leads them to the Valley of the Jedi.
Jan!
Mendoza!
From there, with no choice left, Kyle wipes the dust off his lightsaber and then goes after Dasan and Tavion to try to uncover the Imperial's plans. And again, much like Elite Force, the whole thing is just pure fan service and really in the best way possible. I mean, you got the opening sequence with that iconic title crawl, along with seeing some familiar looking locations, like the War Room from the end of A New Hope. You'll work alongside Lando at one point too.
Lando? What are you doing here?
What does it look like I'm doing? I'm sitting in a cell.
Even visiting Cloud City, and Luke Skywalker frequently shows up throughout the game as well, even fighting alongside Kyle for a short stint.
Look out!
Though I do want to say that it is weird how they got Mark Hamill to voice a character in Soldier of Fortune 2, but he didn't voice Luke Skywalker in a Star Wars game.
If the ways of the Jedi were easy, there'd be millions of us instead of dozens.
Anyway, this is the second time that Raven Software have used that id Tech 3 engine. And it feels like they're pushing it to its limits here, with these absolutely humongous environments, a lot of which are really intricate and challenging to navigate. But there's also a lot of familiar visual motives and texture work which fans of that original film trilogy are definitely going to pick up on.
All too easy.
Not to mention the music is entirely composed of excerpts from those original films, which play underneath all the action and works incredibly well. The main issue that Jedi Outcast has though is the pacing. And seeing as Kyle is no longer a Jedi, this means the opening mission is almost entirely just shooting stuff, with no lightsaber or force powers whatsoever. This results in just shooting the same looking stormtroopers over and over, along with the occasional Imperial officer who gets in your way, neither of which are all that exciting. The only decent gun you've got at that point is the Stormtrooper rifle, and this might be the absolute worst version of this thing that we've ever had, really making you understand why those guys couldn't hit jack shit in the movies. And then even the second mission in some kind of mining facility is more of the same, just with the addition of the bowcaster and some thermal detonators, along with avoiding pitch black caves that are full of spiders, which, yeah, that's fun. What this means is that it's like a good 2 or 3 hours before you finally get your hands on a lightsaber. And even then, like, you still start out pretty damn weak.
I must almost be done with this thing.
Because the first proper level with Kyle's force abilities is on the planet of Nar Shaddaa, where you're out in this very opened up area with lots of snipers and guys throwing thermal detonators to the point that you're almost better off just sticking to your guns. Literally. However, if you can make it through this and stick the whole thing out, by the time you get to Cloud City is where it's going to really start to pick up. And throughout the rest of the game, you're slowly improving your abilities, to the point that you really do become this unstoppable Jedi warrior, charging into rooms like a badass and just taking down droves of stormtroopers with complete ease.
Anger's not the way of the Jedi!
In fact, the way they handle this slow and gradual ramp up in power the further you get into the game is just masterfully done. It's a really fun and simple combat system to understand too. So your main force powers are force push and force pull. Push knocks enemies over and can even send back certain projectiles, whereas pull pulls things towards you but can also snatch a weapon out of an enemy's hand. And even just force pushing a bunch of guys off a nearby ledge and watching them fall to their doom is something that really never does get old. And mapping these to familiar keys gives you instant access to all of Kyle's arsenal. You've also got force jump, heal, speed, and eventually lightning. And mapping these to familiar keys gives you instant access to all of Kyle's arsenal. Like the old Jedi mind trick, you know, in case you need to convince someone that these aren't the droids they're looking for. You'll eventually unlock 3 fighting stances as well for your lightsaber. Basically standard, defensive, and then aggressive. And there's different attack animations for all of these. One of the coolest moves though is being able to throw out Kyle's lightsaber, which chops up enemies before it then glides back to his hand, which is again something I never get sick of. But it wouldn't be very fun though if you just hacked apart brain-dead stormtroopers the entire time, so to mix the whole thing up, you're gonna have to take on the reborn Jedi. Guys who are more or less just Jedis from Wish.com, but have the same abilities that Kyle does. This means that if you try to shoot at them with your guns, they'll just deflect it all back, and if you try to throw a thermal detonator, well, that won't end well either. Which means that most of the time, your trusty lightsaber is the way to go. And I've always found the best strategy here is to jump on their heads as if they're a Koopa Trooper, and then finish them off while they're stunned. Yeah, like not the most honourable way to defeat your opponent, but look, what can I say? These streets are rough. And it's kinda hard to overstate too, just how awesome this lightsaber combat was for the time. I mean, you got to remember that this was really the first time that a Star Wars game so closely replicated the acrobatic and chaotic lightsaber fighting style we saw in those prequel films. I mean, just compare it to the combat in Dark Forces 2, like it's leaps and bounds better. There are times when swapping out to a ranged weapon might be the better option, but for the vast majority of the campaign, you're going to be in full-on lightsaber mode. It marked a turning point, and it set a new standard for the way that lightsaber combat should be handled in video games. And without it, stuff like Jedi Survivor probably wouldn't even exist. I still remember the multiplayer matches from back in the day being absolute pandemonium, as you had people leaping all over the place and sabers flying in every direction as people got cut to ribbons. Oh yeah, and just like Elite Force before it, Jedi Outcast also has a really deep and robust multiplayer mode, again with full bot support. And again too, which much like Elite Force, is another great example of Raven Software being able to take all these elements that were put in place with the eTech 3 engine and rework it for their own projects. Now some people will say that you should play this in third-person mode, and to be fair, the game does shift to a third-person camera by default when you pull out the lightsaber. But I find that the whole thing still works fine even in the first-person view. Oh yeah, and also too, if you've turned on realistic saber combat and dismemberment in the console, well, that first-person mode is really going to let you appreciate just how vicious the combat can be.
It's a shame he wasn't more headstrong. He'll never be the head of a major corporation.
Okay, that'll do.
Okay.
But either way, like, this is still a really impressive combat system that functions regardless of the viewpoint you go with. And to think as well that they improved it even further with Jedi Academy when that came out a couple of years later. Now obviously Jedi Outcast isn't perfect. I do think some of the levels there go on for way longer than they should, and some of the enemy types are an absolute pain in the ass to deal with, especially those shadow troopers you fight near the end of the game. But overall, Jedi Outcast is still easily one of the best Star Wars games ever made, and easily top 3 for Raven Software's library as well. So the Force is definitely strong with this one. Up next is Soldier Fortune 2 Double Helix, a title which also came out in 2002, around the same time as Jedi Outcast, and one which couldn't be further removed. With Jedi Outcast being set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and then Soldier of Fortune being set in the boring, tedious real world. Now, opinions on this one are like arseholes in the sense that everyone has one, a lot of them stink, and your mum likes to tongue punch them. But the general consensus does often tend to be that Double Helix isn't quite as good as its predecessor. And I think the reason for that is because compared to the first game, which was more or less a run-and-gun shooter, in Soldier of Fortune 2, it seems like they tried to make it slower and much more tactical, focusing more on firing in shorter bursts and controlling your recoil, with weapons having a whole lot more spread and kick when firing.
He's over here!
Which means that if the first game was a Rambo movie, well, then the second one is kinda like a Tom Clancy novel. On a positive note though, the weapon models all do look really good and a lot more like their real life counterparts. And to be fair, like, I don't think you could fire an M4 in the real world fully auto and not have that thing kick like an absolute mule. But what this basically translates to is that you can only get away with firing a few shots at a time before then waiting a few seconds for your aim to steady again, utilizing mechanics like peeking around corners to take pot shots at enemies off in the distance. One of the new mechanics is being able to dual wield certain weapons, which is awesome, but you can't fire these things for more than 1 or 2 seconds without your aim going all over the place, which, yeah, is in pretty stark contrast to how the first game played and felt. At least the game does start off pretty awesome with a flashback sequence in Prague where returning bad boy John Mullins is trying to rescue a Russian scientist and help him escape the country. There's a bunch of really cool shootouts in these rain-soaked streets where enemy soldiers all wear these bright yellow raincoats which kind of make them stick out like a dog's balls, followed by a really intense shootout inside a hotel where you first get your hands on the shotgun and can appreciate Double Helix's improved gore mechanics.
Oh my!
Yeah, and it is actually kind of worth mentioning just how advanced and impressive the gore still is in this game. From being able to blow someone's head to pieces with gunfire, through to cutting all their body parts off with the knife. After that though is when the whole thing starts to go to shit, with a really tedious on-rail sequence in the back of a truck, and then a forced stealth section at a railway station, which is the absolute worst part of trial and error gameplay. And then the mission after that takes place in Colombia is just a massive difficulty spike.
Have you been briefed, sir?
Not fully.
Because at that point, it seems all the enemies suddenly become very fond of throwing grenades. And because the entire ground is covered in chest-high grass, you'll be lucky if you ever get to see where one of these things lands, which can lead to lots of instant deaths. Sometimes you might hear the sound of the grenade bouncing somewhere nearby, but more often than not, you're just gonna buy the farm. But then even outside of this Colombia mission, that is still gonna happen a frequent amount.
Ah, shit!
Double Helix has limited saves by default, kind of like the first game did, so my advice here is to make sure you start the new game with a custom difficulty mode, so you can turn those limited saves off. I mean, believe me man, your mental sanity is gonna thank you for it. But probably the most undercooked mechanic in the game is the whole stealth and detection system. I don't know what the plan was here, like if they're trying to copy Metal Gear Solid 2 or something, but either way, they just utterly failed. Right, so on the bottom left of your heads-up display, you'll see you've got a sound meter, which shows how much noise you make when you're moving around. But what you really want to know is how visible you are, which is something the game just never tells you. Not that it really seems to matter anyway, and if you so much as peek around a corner for even a split second, well, an enemy sees you, an alarm instantly goes off, and then everybody in the immediate area seems to know where you are.
What?
With this constant siren being this annoying reminder of your fucker. Now thankfully, outside of that first mission at the train station, you're never forced to remain undetected, but it's still just one of the many factors that just makes Double Helix feel kind of unfinished. I mean, even visually, like the whole thing is just wildly inconsistent. Some environments look really good, like the levels in Colombia for instance, which I remember thinking were the absolute peak of video game graphics at the time. But then other areas just look kinda flat and they lack any real props or other visual details, even kinda looking worse than the first game in a lot of ways. There's a really cool idea in here as well with the whole random mission generator, which can create this endless series of scenarios for the player to mess with. And yeah, like it is kinda cool if you want to replay through the same endless looking voids over and over. I often kind of thought like maybe the lighting hadn't loaded in properly or something because some of these environments are just completely monotone. But in reality, that's just the way the game looks. That truck chase in Prague is a perfect example of this. It's just this empty, barren road surrounded by fog. And then the flyover as you're heading into Colombia also kind of looks like you're stuck in limbo. I mean, what is this? Silent Hill? The campaign definitely still does have its moments though. I mean, moving through the streets of Hong Kong with dual Uzis and an automatic shotgun is pretty damn cool. As is that really intense shootout in a hospital against mercenaries who burst in through the windows. But overall, the whole thing's just pretty crappy, man, and nowhere near as exciting as its predecessor. Where Soldier of Fortune 2 really excelled though was its multiplayer mode, which in a lot of ways I remember being a lot similar to Counter-Strike. Just in the way that it tried to simulate real-life weapon ballistics and handling and kind of focus more on strategic movement and map awareness. And there's even shreds of that multiplayer community still alive and kicking, you know, even now in 2024. But where that single player is concerned though, honestly, it's just not a very good game. And I've seen a lot of theories online as to why this is the case, with it often having something to do with Jedi Outcast taking the development focus, which as a result is probably why Double Helix didn't get as much attention or polish as it probably should have.
Not to me, it doesn't.
Watch your mouth, Mullins, or you're gonna find yourself off this assignment.
You're out of here!
Still though, at the end of the day, it's way better than Soldier of Fortune Payback.
You in for big disappointment, American.
Next, we're jumping ahead to 2005 with Quake 4, with Raven Software taking the reins from its software after Quake 3 Arena way back in 1999, which ended up with an entry that sees the series returning to a single-player focused experience. Often seen as the black sheep of the franchise, in Quake 4 you're playing as Corporal Matthew Kane, one certified badass.
Matthew Kane,
One certified badass.
Not to mention a member of Rhino Squad, which is the same nickname that me and the boys call your mum and her friends. Anyway, Rhino Squad, along with a bunch of other squads, are being sent to the planet of Strogos, and after the defeat of the Macron in Quake 2, humanity is making this big final push to hopefully wipe these assholes out once and for all. The first thing you notice when playing through this is that opening cinematic, which is really reaching filmic levels of scripting, music, and cinematography. And then throughout the game there's also a large focus on all these kind of sequences, introducing a whole cast of fully voiced characters that work alongside the player.
Hello, Corporal Kane. It's good to finally meet you.
And what's kind of awesome too is that it doesn't just kill these guys off in the first 10 minutes either, with a lot of them being around for more or less the entire story. It is kind of weird though how Quake 4 has the appearance of a dumbed down military shooter, when in reality the actual core of the gameplay is truly proper old school shooting, with projectile weapons, fixed health, and player mobility playing a huge factor. The weapons are like a combination of things from both Quake 1 and 2, with weapons like the nail gun, the lightning gun, grenade launcher, rocket launcher, and then the hyper blaster. In lieu of a BFG though, you instead get the dark matter gun, which for all intents and purposes is pretty much just the same thing. And then most of the enemies are just updated versions of those we first saw in Quake 2, like the Gunner, the Gladiator, and then the Berserker. And then towards the end of the campaign, you come up against other Marines who've been strogified. And this stuff right here is the absolute peak of the combat, man, with gunfights that can be genuinely challenging. Just all really feels like what might have happened if Quake 2 had come out in 2005 instead of 1997. But it's also another really good example of the id Tech engine being put to great use. And the way that light, colour, and shadow have been used in some of these levels is nothing short of artistic. I mean, a lot of people refer to this one as Call of Quake when it first came out, which really was a bit of a litmus test to see if people had even bothered to play past the first 15 or 20 minutes. I mean, look, like, don't get me wrong, there's definitely crappy aspects here to the campaign. I think those on-rails vehicle sections are kind of aids. But for the vast majority of the time, you know, at least during the bits where you're on foot, a lot of this stuff is pretty damn good. And a great example of older mechanics brought across into a newer engine. That being no weapon limit, no iron sights, along with being able to quick save whenever you want. And just because this game took a bit of extra time to tell a story, it doesn't make it bad.
Oh yeah, Matthew Kane, our wayward Strog.
In fact, I reckon the inclusion of all these side characters goes a long way in really emphasizing the scale of this assault. Whereas when you look back on Quake 2, which really was more or less the same premise, you really just felt like a lone soldier single-handedly turning the tide of the war. In Quake 4, you still are very much the one-man army responsible for saving the day, but there's much more of a focus there now on your character being a small cog in a much bigger machine.
Intelligence Division has discovered that the Strog function through a massive communication system called the Nexus.
And it does a great job of showing how dependent humanity is on defeating the Strog and how much they all need to work together. Oh yeah, plus I dare anyone to say that Strauss isn't a hilarious character.
I am Private Johann Strauss, you have no doubt heard of me.
Kane, you're with Strauss. Find those controls.
You assign me only one guard? Must I die to show you how valuable I am?
You'll be fine, Strauss.
Not to mention, this has, hands down, one of the most brutal body horror sequences I'd argue in all of gaming. Yeah, early on in the game there, where you're captured by the Strog and get to watch yourself be hacked to pieces, bit by bit, as you're getting slowly turned into one of them. Yeah, and I can't think of any other game where you get your character's legs chopped off in real time. But it also plays a pretty big role in the gameplay as well, because from that point on, your movement speed and your maximum health is upgraded, along with having the newfound ability of being able to read and interact with Strog equipment. So yeah, it's like whenever I see people complaining about this one as if it's like a bad Quake game, it just kind of makes me wonder how far they've actually played into the game. Because if they truly did, then they would have actually seen how it more or less just plays like Quake 2 from that point on. So yeah, like all up, obviously not the best game in the franchise, but easily one of the most misunderstood. Up next is Raven's reboot for the Wolfenstein series, this time taken over from Grey Matter Studios with their previous effort in 2001, with the aptly titled Wolfenstein releasing in 2009.
OSA headquarters. This is Agent BJ Blazkowicz. Wake up the director. Tell him we have to meet as soon as I land.
Yes!
And much like Quake 4, this is a game that seemed to get a lot of unwarranted negativity and hate, something again which I've just never quite understood. Story in this one revolves around everyone's favourite ass-kicker BJ trying to find an artifact called the Thule Medallion.
But I'm more concerned about that medallion I found.
Which is a device that lets him transport back and forth between the real world and into this sort of gateway dimension called the Veil. Ever since Spirit Destiny, the series has always had a bit of an occult undertone, so all of this stuff is absolutely on brand. So I'd argue that it's about as Wolfenstein-y as a plot ever needed to be.
Get out! Get out of there!
I mean, you got Death's Head coming back again as the main villain, plus they even found a way to bring back Hans Gross from Wolfenstein 3D as one of the main bosses.
Guten Tag! Guten Tag!
Not to mention the music's again being composed by Bill Brown, who worked on Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Now, this medallion being a central part of the gameplay also equates to some really handy powers for BJ, like being able to slow down time, activate a berserk mode, or bring up a powerful shield.
Okay, you have some skill.
And then after upgrading this thing throughout the campaign, it also gets to the point where these powers become utterly broken. So like activating slow motion, for instance, will send out a powerful shockwave that vaporizes nearby enemies. As for the basic weapons, well, you've got all the World War II staples like the MP40, the MP43, and the Kar 98K. But then in typical Wolfenstein fashion, there's a bunch of ridiculously overpowered made-up guns as well. Like you got the returning Tesla cannon, you got the particle cannon, which is more or less like the proton pack from Ghostbusters. And then finally the Lycan Faust, which pretty much just seems to disintegrate everything it hits. Yeah, this is a really great weapon if you not only want to kill someone, but also fuck them up on a molecular level. Just really captures that whole retro-futuristic vibe that they're going for, along with the whole what-if scenario, if Nazi scientists ever managed to create these incredibly dangerous and volatile weapons. Oh yeah, they've even brought back those leather-clad elite guard units as well. Yeah, the perfect example of a don't stick your dick in crazy enemy type if I ever saw one. The problem that a lot of people seem to have with this one is that instead of it being a linear shooter, Raven decided to make it somewhat open world, with the campaign being set in the largest city of Eisenstadt, which the player is free to explore at their own leisure. Even able to complete side missions apart from the main story, along with finding collectibles and even gold to upgrade all your weapons and abilities. And it's kind of crazy to think that an open world game, where you fought back against retro-futuristic Nazis with otherworldly powers, was at the time seen as being boring and generic. Wolfenstein is another game that uses that id Tech 4 engine, which is kind of impressive, considering that before this, it was really just used to create a lot of darker interior areas like we saw in Doom 3, Quake 4, and Prey. But now you've got these large and opened up maps, with some of them even set during the daytime with foliage, grass, and other natural effects. Definitely the polar opposite to the kind of metallic environments we'd seen beforehand, which really just shows the versatility that engine had. And then activate BJ's medallion and you got transported into the Veil, where everything looked all withered away and gritty, highlighting the otherworldly powers that mysterious artifact held. So yeah, like you definitely can't say that it lacked creativity. Overall, I really think this one was just a victim of bad timing more than anything else, especially too considering how much we took gaming back in 2009 for granted. The one main problem Wolfenstein does have though are its boss fights, which are just fucking awful. And I've noticed that Raven have always kind of struggled to make compelling boss fights. I mean, the bosses back in Heretic and Hexen, for instance, you know, you just shoot them over and over until they die. Or the one in Soldier Fortune 2, which is just the same attack chopper recycled twice. Or how about just in X-Men Origins, for instance, where they just recycled that same boss type a couple of dozen times throughout the campaign, as opposed to actually creating something unique. Wolfenstein's bosses on the one hand are, at least different from fight to fight, but then they're just so tedious and frustrating to deal with. Still though, I am absolutely a Wolfenstein apologist. And I think what makes this series so interesting is the fact that it's been worked on by so many different developers. And from id Software all the way up to Machine Games, it's always been kind of fascinating to see how each team is going to end up putting their own spin on the formula. Most importantly, keeping the essence of the franchise alive. That being shooting lots of Nazis and other horrific creatures with higher powered weaponry. Even if that did somehow devolve into a topless pregnant woman firing dual machine guns. Either way, on that level, this 2009 reboot absolutely succeeds. Which, you know what, is all it ever needed to do. So, just like Quake 4, this one's alright in my books.
Yeah!
And that brings us on to the last game in the video with 2010's Singularity. And this one definitely has the most unique story out of everything these developers have worked on. So in Singularity, you're playing as a soldier named Renko, who's part of a squad that's crashed on an island that used to be an old Soviet testing ground back in the 1950s. During the prologue, he's inexplicably sent back in time to 1995, around the same point when the facility was being destroyed, but more importantly, around the same time that Marty McFly went back in time to make sure his dad asked his mum out to the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. Anyway, Renko innocently rescues a man who's about to fall to his death, but inadvertently rewriting history in the process and then changing the events of the future.
Oh, shit!
Because it turns out the guy that he saved, a Russian named Demichev, is a total dickbag, and has spent the last 50 years waiting for Renko's return and plotting ahead. Luckily though, he's able to escape and is saved by a woman named Catherine, working with her and a scientist named Barasov.
You must have a lot of questions, but we don't have a lot of time.
Well, hello, beautiful.
And it then becomes a bit of a back and forth of going back in time repeatedly to try and right all of these wrongs. But look, if Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 taught us anything, it's that the harder you try, the worse it gets. And look, as a general rule of thumb, if you're ever going to go time traveling and see someone about to die in some kind of horrific accident, you're really better off just leaving them to their fate. At the core of all of this is something called the TMD, or the Time Manipulation Device, which is the source of all this time traveling power, and something that Renko soon gets his hands on, which also too plays a pretty crucial role in the story. Because not only is this thing pretty pivotal to the whole overall goal, but it also impacts the gameplay in some pretty fundamental ways. For starters, with the press of a button you can age or de-age objects in the game world, from things like stairways, crates and item boxes, even through to electrical panels and even enemies, causing them to turn to dust and whittle away in real time. Yeah, kind of like that end scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And it actually works into the puzzles pretty well. Like put a crumpled and destroyed metal crate underneath a roller door, for instance, and then de-age it, and it's going to lift the door up as it restores itself. But more than that, like, it's also pretty much the gravity gun from Half-Life 2, and lets you pick up a bunch of objects like explosive barrels and propane tanks, along with enemy grenades and even rockets. If that ain't enough, there's also a handy melee attack as well, with a shockwave knocking enemies back along with blowing their goddamn limbs off. And then the further you get into the game, you'll start to unlock more abilities and upgrades, along with upgrading all of the basic weapons as well, so you never really feel like the whole thing's becoming stagnant. Just kind of feels like a combination of Bioshock and Half-Life 2, with the combat focusing around a combination of these TMD abilities working in tandem with all of the shooting. But similar to Bioshock, it's also got that feeling of exploring this once flourishing environment that's now become ground zero for some kind of horrible tragedy. In fact, you'll often see these ghostly hallucinations of past events, and the previous inhabitants are now all mutated and hostile. You know, a lot like the splicers in Rapture. When it comes to the shooting, there's a standard but effective roster of guns to use, like a revolver, a shotgun, assault rifle, sniper rifle, and something called the Seeker, which lets you fire these remotely controlled rounds that explode on impact. Or how about a grenade launcher that also has controllable explosives? Most of the enemies are just variants of enemy soldiers, that being guys with assault rifles or shotguns who usually hang back and shoot at you from a distance. But then later on, after you've messed up the space-time continuum, you'll come up against armored guys with miniguns who are more resistant to your powers. Luckily though, they've still got a pretty fundamental weakness to being shot repeatedly in the face. A lot of the combat areas often have a few ways you can mess around with the enemies, and even just basic things like shooting nitrogen tanks and turning enemies into blocks of ice.
Allow me to break the ice.
And I mean, is there anything more satisfying in video games than shattering frozen enemies?
The Iceman cometh.
But even just the basic gore effects become repeatedly entertaining, like blowing someone's head off and seeing blood spurt out of the neck hole as they slump to the ground. Singularity also comes from that era where every second video game seemed to use the Unreal Engine 3. But it's another one of those titles that seems to put the engine to great effect, with some really artistic and gorgeous looking environments. And there's a real sense of these various eras on the island all being handcrafted that's just let them age really well. Plus, the way the visuals effortlessly hop between the two different time periods is also kinda clever, and the way the TMD restores or destroys objects in real time also looks cool. The only negative thing that Singularity has working against it is that it is a very short game, coming in at around 4 or 5 hours. Nothing in the game is really likely to stump the player either or take that long to figure out, and then the combat also becomes laughably easy by about the halfway mark. By the point where you've got so many power-ups and upgrades that you become pretty much unstoppable. The one thing that does genuinely piss me off though are the frequent sections where you need to go up against these little exploding spider things. And look man, like I've said it numerous times, but I guess it bears repeating, and that's that these type of suicidal kamikaze style enemies are never fun to deal with. Alright, maybe with the exception of Serious Sam, because at least in those games you were often out in the middle of the desert. But in most other cases, something in large numbers that just runs right up to the player and explodes, it's not fun to deal with. It's just annoying. Especially when those explosions seem to interrupt the healing animation. Oh yeah, along with these things too, that I can only describe as giant mutated crabs. Yeah, they can fuck right off. For some reason as well, you can only hold 2 weapons at a time, which is a completely pointless limitation, given the game's otherwise old school feel. And you can only sprint for a few seconds as well before having to stop and catch your breath, which becomes really juxtaposed with these more older mechanics like the fixed health bar. Still though, for the brief time this whole thing lasts, Singularity is a really fun experience.
Just like Mir 12 said.
And it has the kind of over-the-top violence and satisfying shooting mechanics that Raven Software had really become known for. And you know what? Honestly, I'd have to say that I think it's their best game, at least as far as the first-person shooters are concerned. I mean, it's not a Doom clone, it's not a Quake or Wolfenstein sequel, it's something that they pretty much made from the ground up, and it ends up being really enjoyable from start to finish. So again, you know, damn good stuff. Playing through it though, you do kind of come to that sad realization when you remember that this was ultimately their swan song. Because after this was when they entered that period that so many people refer to as the COD mines.
Gentlemen, lock and load.
Yeah man, from that point on, their credits almost entirely consist of just assisting on Call of Duty titles. Starting with the original Black Ops in 2010, and then more recently, Black Ops Cold War in 2020. Which to be fair though, is probably one of the best of the single player campaigns in the series. I mean, not only did this have one of the more interesting storylines in the franchise to date, but also just some of the more memorable set pieces. Like an entire mission set inside the KGB headquarters, sneaking around undercover and carrying out your objectives. Which ended in this really cool sequence where you and your boys all donned heavy body armor and then blasted your way out the front door with machine guns. The Vietnam flashbacks had some really cool licensed music as well. And the overarching storyline was an absolute trip, with a twist ending I doubt anyone saw coming. And considering they're working on the upcoming Black Ops 6, maybe it might be a long overdue return to form. I mean, God knows the series needs one after Modern Warfare 3. Yikes. Either way though, at the end of the day, Raven Software absolutely earned their place up there amongst the best of the old school development crews. And it's kind of crazy looking at how many good shooters they worked on, considering too that they were still releasing other non-first person shooters in between everything else. I'd like to think that there's some hope for a Heretic or Hexen reboot in the future. After seeing Pete Hines randomly wearing a Hexen shirt during one of those gaming events, I'm kind of hopeful that there's a bit of a chance there. Nothing else, like gamers you'd hope would be willing to give it a shot, especially given the success and popularity we've had with the Doom franchise. But if they want to go to work on making a Singularity 2, well, then I'd be fine with that as well. Anyway, thanks for watching.